Just as I am, thou wilt receive, wilt welcome, pardon, cleanse, relieve, because thy promise I believe. O Lamb of God, I come, I come. How Jesus was going to carry all of our sins and take all of the wrath and the punishment from God for our sins, for our benefit, for our salvation. And how Jesus became resolute. And after his final prayer, with each prayer he became more and more resolute. He got up and he said, "Now it's time. Now it's time. And let us go. The time is at hand. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise and let us go. My betrayer is at hand." Jesus knew that the band of men was coming with Judas at the lead, and he's prepared mentally, he's prepared spiritually and emotionally to go and to do what he came to this earth to do. So let's begin reading at chapter 26, verse 47 through 56. While he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him." And he came up to Jesus at once and said, "Greetings, Rabbi." And he kissed him. And Jesus said, "Friend, do what you came to do." Then they came up and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And behold, one of those who was with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you not think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send more than 12 legions of angels? But how then should the scriptures be fulfilled, that it must be so?" At that hour Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out as against a robber, with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you didn't seize me. But all this has taken place that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled." Then all the disciples left him and fled. So Jesus is coming out of the garden, and Judas and this great band. And how did this band of men come prepared? Swords and clubs. They had seen Jesus, and he reminds them of this. You know, you've seen me teaching in the temple day by day. You've seen me walking among you. Why are you coming out with swords and clubs? Why do you think they did that? Why do you think they came with swords and clubs? You think they were hoping for a fight? What happens when a lot of people get together? A mob mentality happens, doesn't it? And we're going to see a little bit more of that later. But this mob mentality, and what happens to common sense? What happens to our rational way of thinking when we get together and this mob mentality takes over? We put our common sense down and we pick up a club. That's right. We lose our sense of what's right and what's moral. And we actually revert to our base self, don't we? We revert to all of our baser emotions, our anger, all of the negative things that are inside us. And all, in essence, a lot of times, don't we take out our anger against other people? When we get in a mob mentality, we take it out against somebody who had no part in what we're really angry about. This mob was angry. They were angry at the Romans. They were angry at their situation. Who knows, there were some of them that were probably in poverty that were angry at their situation. They all get together and all this anger flows together, and that blood starts pumping and the adrenaline starts going. They're gathering clubs, and it's at nighttime, so we know they had clubs and torches and swords, and they were looking for a fight. They were just ready to go. And Jesus says, why? You know that that's not me. You have seen me. He knew that his reputation preceded him. He knew that there was no need for that type of mentality because he was determined to do what the Father sent him to do, and that was to face his destiny. Judas came up and he had prearranged this, that what was the sign that this man was Jesus? A kiss. Okay? A couple of curious things about that. Do you think the chief priests and scribes and Pharisees didn't know who Jesus was by sight? We see over and over and over in the ministry of Jesus how he taught these same scribes and Pharisees and chief priests, and how they confronted him and tried to test him and tried to trick him and tried to get him to say something that they could use against him. So undoubtedly they knew who he was by sight. Ross?
The scripture doesn't say the chief priests were there. These men were sent by the chief priests.
That's true.
He was saying that, so
that's true. Some of the other Gospels do say that the chief priests and scribes were there. So one other thought I had, and as they take him to this trial, we know that the Sanhedrin was present. Have you ever thought about who was a member of the Sanhedrin at this time that we don't really see anything about in this story? Saul of Tarsus. Because undoubtedly he was a member of the Sanhedrin, or at least part of the leadership at this time, because the establishment of the church, how many days later? About 40 days, less than 2 months. When the church is established, he's involved in the stoning of Jesus, and he was already an established member of the Jewish leadership. I'm sorry? Stephen, stoning of Stephen. That Saul was involved in that, and he approved of it. He held the coats. And so I've always wondered, where was Saul in all of this? We don't hear of him in this, but undoubtedly he was part of the leadership at this time. We don't know if he was out of town, but just a curious point of thought is, this was a group of men that Saul was part of. And this type of mentality of they were carrying these swords and clubs and torches, and they were ready to go up against Jesus. They had a lot of anger. Didn't Saul show that same anger when he was pursuing Christians? He wanted to get letters from the chief priests to go up to Damascus and do what? Seize them and do what with them? Drag them back. He was filled with, what would we call it today? Righteous indignation. His own self-righteousness, what he thought was right. he had that same mentality. But this group of men came and seized Jesus. There were probably hundreds, and Judas led them, and he brings them up and he gives them a kiss. Why do you think Judas, evidently Judas proposed this, why do you think Judas proposed that the one that I kiss, you seize him? Why would Judas betray Jesus with, wouldn't you say that's one of the ultimate signs of affection? It is curious to think about that Judas was one of them that chose a kiss to betray the Lord, and how what one would think that is a sign of love was actually a sign of treachery and betrayal. And Jesus knew his heart. And what did Jesus tell him? Do what you came to do. But it's kind of funny. What's the word he used right before that? Jesus still called him friend. Jesus still had compassion for Judas. Still was sorrowful at the act that Judas was going to complete, because Jesus even cared for Judas's soul. How do we know that? Because Jesus cares for everybody's soul. Even no matter what we've done, even no matter how far we get away from, how often we betray Jesus in our life, Jesus cares for us. He cared for Judas. Judas chose not to accept it. Ross?
A possible reason is that at that time Judas had not realized that he wasn't going to accomplish what he wanted. He wanted Jesus to rise up and overpower them, throw the Jews and the Romans out, and take over and establish the kingdom. So he was possibly still acting.
Okay. What Ross is saying is, it's possible that Judas was hoping against hope that with this act of bringing these men against him, that he could force Jesus to do what he wanted Jesus to do. And that was to rise up against the Romans, to rise up against the leadership, to become the earthly king that many of the apostles thought that he could be and should be. And so one theory is that Judas was doing this as a last-ditch effort to make Jesus fight back, to make Jesus establish that kingdom. And in fact, if that's what Jesus wanted, was that possible? Could he have done that? Jesus himself said, "Don't you know that I could have called legions of angels and they would be here at my disposal?" We sing that song, one of my favorite songs, 10,000 Angels. He could have called 10,000 angels, but instead he died alone for what? For you and me. And so he's in the garden, they're there to take him, and Jesus turns to these men, and we read in some of the other gospel accounts, and he says, "Who are you looking for?" And what do they say? "We're looking for Jesus of Nazareth." And he says, "I am he. I'm the man that you're looking for." And what do? They fall back. It says they fell back amazed. Why do you think they would be amazed? Okay, very unusual for a guy that's fixing to be arrested to say, "That's me. You're looking for me." What did we see on TV a couple of times in the news this last week? When somebody's about to be arrested, they take off and run. They drive away. They do all kinds of things to try to escape. Jesus says, I'm the man that you're looking for." They fall back amazed. And so he asks them a second time, "Okay, who are you looking for?" And they say, "Jesus of Nazareth." He says, again, "I am he." They fall back again. They just can't believe that Jesus isn't going to give them the fight that they're looking for. That could be a reason they fought. They were ready for a fight. They didn't think it was going to be that easy. They didn't think he was going to comply, that he was going to go willingly. And so he gives himself up to them. And what do? As they prepare to arrest him and take him away? They bind him. They take ropes and cords and they bind him like a common criminal, like he was resisting, like he was a threat to them. Now, how ironic when he tells them that I am he, that they had to bind and to tie him. Let's turn to John chapter 18. John chapter 18. In the earlier account that we read that someone with Jesus drew his sword and cut off the ear of one of the servants. And so in John chapter 18, we're going to find out a little bit more detail about that story. Beginning in verse 10, it says, "Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, 'Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?' So Peter draws his sword and takes a swing. And he's swinging at one of the high priest's servants. It's unlikely that this high priest servant had a sword because he served the high priest. He was probably a Levite, and Levites were forbidden to carry swords. And so, but Peter does try to defend Jesus in whatever manner he could. What had Peter promised Jesus not long before this? He'd die. When Jesus told him he was about to be betrayed, that he would be turned over and that he would be killed, Peter said, "I'll even die before I betray you." And so Peter did. We have to give Peter this. He did try to defend Jesus in his own way, and he drew his sword, knowing, it says that there was a mob there, probably hundreds, against 12, and Jesus. But he drew his sword and he swung and he cut off the ear of Malchus's ear. It's interesting that they name the servant because we're going to see that in just a few moments where that plays a more significant role. But he draws his sword and Jesus tells him to put it back. To put it back, shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? Another version, another gospel says that Jesus told him to put it back. Don't you know that people who live by the sword will what? Die by the sword. And so Jesus tried to tell them that violence, this earthly rebellion, is not what he came to do, that he came to die for the sins of many. There's an application here that Jesus is trying to say. Who is this battle really against? When Jesus is facing the cross, who is the battle? Is it Jesus against the chief priests, the scribes, the Jewish nation, the Romans? Who is the battle against? Okay, the battle is Jesus against Satan. This is a spiritual battle. And the application here is that Jesus is trying to tell them, you can't win a spiritual battle by physical means. Spiritual battles can only be won on the spiritual level. They can only be won with faith, and faith in the one who was willing to give himself. He could have called 185,000 angels. That's what the legions were, including horsemen. He could have called 185,000 if he wanted, but he didn't want to fight the physical battle. He wanted to fight the spiritual battle. We go we go on down. Let's turn over to Luke chapter 22. Then Jesus, beginning with verse 52, then Jesus said to the chief priests and the officers of the temples and the elders who had come out against him. That's Ross, that's where we know that they were there, is in this passage. That Jesus said to the chief priests and officers of the temple and the elders who had come out against him, have you not come out against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me. But this is your hour, the hour of darkness. He's telling them with this very last statement that you think you've won. You think you've won. You think you're doing what God wants you to do, but this is really an hour of darkness. This is the ultimate time where Satan is going to confront Jesus and bring darkness for a moment on the earth. What happened when Jesus died? But what does it say? Right at that moment, darkness came upon the earth. This was the hour of darkness. This was the moment that Satan thought that he had won. This is when Satan is doing his little victory dance. You know, we see these football players do their little, this is Satan doing his victory dance because he thinks he has Jesus exactly where he wants him. But the apostles, those that were standing with him at this moment, they abandon him. They flee. They run away. And it says, no man remained with him. Some of the accounts talk about they reached out and they grabbed a young man. In Mark's account, that they grabbed a young man. We don't really know who this young man was, but some writers have speculated that it was Mark himself when he writes this, that the young man was grabbed. It says he was clothed in a nightshirt and they grabbed him and the nightshirt tore and he ran off naked. And so it does mention that it was him that this young man was there with Jesus, but everyone had left him when he was seized. And so now they take him and they take him to a trial. But one of the questions that arise is, where are we in the mob scene? Where are you in the mob scene? Where am I in the mob scene? If we're there, we're part of this. Are we part of the mob? Are we Judas? Are we Peter? Are we one of the apostles that's running away from the scene? Are we that young man Mark trying to get as close as we can without being seen? It's very possible that we all fit into this story somewhere, because I know that there are times in my own life when I was Peter. I denied my Lord. I was a young man in a basketball tournament. Many of y'all know that I went to Fort Worth Christian. We were in this basketball tournament. I was in high school. I thought I was, what's the expression? I thought I was all that. And we were in this town at this tournament. We'd gone to a place to eat, and there were some girls from another school there, and we were all kind of flirting together, and they asked, well, where do you go to school? What's FWC stand for? And we just looked at each other, and we said, Fort Worth Central. That was my Peter moment. I didn't want them to know that I was with Christ. And I think about that every time I read this story. Where are you in this story? Where have you been in this story in your life? Now we move on to the trial. Let's open our Bibles back to Matthew chapter 26.
Les, I think
Yes.
most of the people actually were home in bed asleep.
Most of the people were home in bed asleep. Very, very, very possible. We know that it was the leaders there that were stirring up the mob, in which one of the things we're going to find out, this whole process that takes place right now was illegal under Jewish law. For them to arrest and try somebody at night was against Jewish law. Trials had to start from daybreak to sundown. They could not be conducted at night. And so this whole process that we're going to see here that takes place now under Jewish law was illegal. And yet it was the scholars of the law, the enforcers of the law, who were breaking the law. And yet, what were they accusing Jesus of doing? Breaking the law. And so this whole trial that we see here that take place, let's begin reading at Matthew 26, verse 57. Then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. And Peter was following him at a distance. And as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and going inside, he sat with the guards to see the end. And now let's go down to verse 59. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death, but they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last, two came forward and said, "This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days." And the high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But Jesus remained silent. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." And Jesus said to him, "You have said so. But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated on the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment?" They answered, "He deserves death." Then they spit in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you?" Again, he's brought into this house of Caiaphas, the high priest, which Caiaphas, being the high priest, was actually a violation of the law itself. We find in some other Gospels that they also took him to see Annas, which was Caiaphas' father, who was originally the high priest. The high priest position was appointed for life. It was not a position that transferred from person to person. When Eli, for example, was high priest before Samuel, it wasn't until Eli's death that Samuel took over. And so Aaron's son didn't take over until Aaron passed away. The high priest position was intended to be a lifetime role. But yet here, the Romans had removed Annas from power. From whatever reason, the Roman prefect had removed him and set up Caiaphas, his son, in his place. So Annas was really the power behind the throne. But Caiaphas has the title of high priest. And they had gathered at his house. We read that Peter was following at a distance to see how this story was going to end. But again, this trial was taking place in the middle of the night, nothing that should have taken place. Let's turn to John chapter 18. Let's go to verse 12. John chapter 18, beginning with verse 12. So the band of soldiers and their captain, the officers of the Jews, arrested Jesus and bound him. First, they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. So, is it a fair statement to say that the guilty verdict had been decided before the trial took place? And what we read about this, if we went back further, we won't take the time to do that right now, but this decision that Caiaphas made was made right after Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. It says they got together, and Caiaphas says it is more expedient that one man should die for his people. So the decision to kill Jesus was made all the way back when Lazarus was raised from the dead. But they came to do this mock trial because that's what it was. It was a mockery of Jewish law, and they were going to convict Jesus. Another way in which this trial was not illegal under Jewish law was, unlike the American system of justice, when you go to trial here, what happens first? The prosecution presents their case, right? They have to prove that there's a reason for you to be charged. They have to prove that there's a reasonable idea that you are guilty. Well, under Jewish law, it actually worked in reverse. The defense was the first to present their case. You were told what you were accused of, and then you got to defend yourself. But what happened in this case? Was Jesus ever told what he was accused of? No. They just began bringing, it says, many witnesses. And many witnesses for what purpose? Many witnesses to bring false testimony against them. So they knew ahead of time what they were trying to get from these witnesses, correct? Does anybody know what the penalty for bearing false witness was under Jewish law? Death. So here again, they were committing something worthy of death in order to put Jesus to death for something he didn't even do. And so the amount of effort that these men were putting in to crucify Jesus, the positions that they were putting themselves in, show how much they hated Jesus, how much they hated the Lord, and hated that he was teaching the people and drawing the people away from them, usurping their positions of power and of status, and actually condemning them for their stances. Remember, on several occasions, once he called them a brood of vipers, once he called them, you're just like a bunch of whitewashed tombs full of dead men's bones. He would ridicule them in front of the people because of their hypocrisy and their unwillingness to follow the spirit of the law and yet enforce the letter of the law on the people. And so they charged him with these false witnesses. But even with these false witnesses, they couldn't get a case against Jesus. So Caiaphas gets frustrated. He gets aggravated. He stands up, in which is very unusual for the high priest to take a role in this Jewish trial. But he says, "Don't you have anything to say for yourself? Don't you have anything to defend yourself with?" And it says, Jesus remained silent. Why do you think Jesus kept silent? Why would Jesus not speak up at this trial? They wouldn't believe him anyway. That's evident by the length of effort and the things that they're willing to do, the ethics that they're willing to give up to hold this trial and to do the things that they're doing, show that they've crossed the line and they're willing to go however far it takes. So they won't believe him. Jesus knows that it serves no purpose. And then Caiaphas continues to question him. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. And Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in the synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me and what I said to them. They know what I did. When he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, Is that how you answer the high priest? And Jesus answered him, If I said what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if I said what is right, why do you strike me? He said this to Annas, who then sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. And so Jesus refused to answer, refused to play the game with Annas. He refused to play the game with Caiaphas. And he was struck by an officer for his response. Notice that Jesus didn't respond with violence. What is our tendency as human? When somebody hits us, what do we want to do? Hit him back. And yet Jesus turns the other cheek. But he doesn't take it without anything. What did Jesus do? He used his words. What do we try to tell our kids to do when they come into a conflict? Use your words. I just thought this was curious that Jesus does respond to the man who hit him. If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said was right, why do you strike me? And so Jesus was a political hot potato. Do you notice here that they're beginning to hand him? Annas sends him to Caiaphas. Caiaphas sends him back to Annas. And now they're going to pass him back and forth. Why do you think none of them would actually stand up and say, okay, we're done. It's enough? They feared the people. Exactly. It said over and over, they feared the people. Why would they fear the people? Okay, if the people found out the truth, they could be charged under Jewish law. But what else? There were many people who believed Jesus. There were many people who believed in him, many followers that Jesus had. Do you think that's probably why the reason they arrested him at night and they drug him away at night and they conducted an illegal trial at night? Because they knew that the people believed in Jesus. They knew that this was a political hot potato. And so they pass him on. So let's turn back to Matthew chapter 26. Okay, let's go down to verse 57. This was where they conduct a legal trial. Evidently, this trial takes place in the daylight. The daytime has come, and they also have a quorum. To condemn a man to death, you had to have the entire council present. And so at this point, evidently, the morning has broken. They've assembled the entire Sanhedrin. Verse 57, then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and elders had gathered. And Peter was following at a distance. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking the false testimony that they may put him to death. And so they brought him to the whole council. They can't find any reason to condemn him. And so the high priest, Caiaphas, says, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Son of God. Caiaphas is calling on the name of God as a last act of frustration, trying to goad Jesus. I call on the name of God. If you are the Son of God, tell us so. He's mocking Jesus. He's goading Jesus. Then he says, you have said so, but I tell you now, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Jesus says, you said that I'm the Son of God. But I tell you, there's a time coming. You're here to judge me. I tell you, there's a time that's coming in what's going to happen. I'm going to judge you. I'm going to be seated at the right hand of God. I'm going to be seated in the position of power. You judge me now, but the time's coming when the tables are turned. I am going to judge you. And so they had violated these trial laws. Oh, also there were no trials to be conducted during Passover. You could only acquit on the day of a trial. You couldn't render a guilty verdict on the day of a trial because you were supposed to take a day to consider mercy under Jewish law. Another problem they had is they had to convict with two witnesses that were interviewed separately so that their stories could be corroborated. All the false witnesses that they brought against Jesus, they couldn't corroborate anything to convict him by. And so that's why the high priest had to goad him. And they tried to use Jesus' statement as, what more do we need to hear? This is blasphemy. And blasphemy is worthy of death. So he committed all kinds of violation of Jewish law. No defense was presented before the verdict was rendered. Jesus could have taken the fifth. He could have under Jewish law, he could have remained silent and they could not prove the false testimony. And under Jewish law, he should have been acquitted. But the mob mentality took over. It says that after he was pronounced guilty by the high priest, what did they do? What? I'm sorry? They spit on him and they cursed him and they began to do what else? Hit him. They beat him and spit on him. And these are the religious leaders. These are the people that are supposed to be the holy men of Israel. And they are spitting on Jesus and hitting him, doing things that they would probably not do. How do we get into this mob mentality? What's one of the benefits of the mob mentality? They allude to it right there. I'm sorry? Thought I heard somebody say it. Okay, he was a threat. But what about anonymity? Is there a certain anonymity that comes in mobs where you think nobody is going to know who you were? What did they ask Jesus? Tell us who hit you. Prophesy. They were hitting because they get in this mob mentality. They know that they think, rather, that they have anonymity to protect them, that they are protected by Jesus not knowing who they were. But will Jesus know who they are? We don't have time quite yet, but we know that this story is very familiar in the betrayal of Peter. The times that Peter denied Jesus before these men. I said that Malchus was going to be important because one of the men, we know that the young girl confronted Jesus on 2 occasions, and then it says one man confronted Jesus who was a relative of the man that Peter cut his ear off. He was a relative of Malchus, and so he's the third one to come to Peter and say, you were with him. And then it says, Peter began to curse and say, I do not know him. So I want to leave you with one set of thoughts about Peter and denying Jesus. He recognized the sign, the crow. He looked into the eyes of the Lord. He remembered his words. and he recognized his sin. A few things are going to happen for us on the day of judgment. We're all going to recognize the sign when the trumpets sound. We're all going to look into the eyes of Jesus and stand before him. We're all going to remember his words. And we're all going to remember every deed we performed on earth. What's unclear is our reaction to this moment. We don't have to run away weeping. We can actually give ourselves, commit ourselves, and confess the Lord today. What's your choice going to be today? Thank you.